All right, what's up, AP Euro family? So here we go. We're looking at the radical phase of the French Revolution. So let's just dive right into this bad boy. It's one of my favorite parts of history is actually this topic here. So at the start of the French Revolution, it says what was the original or the common view in England and really kind of across Europe at this time. So if we look at a map, right, France was this major power, a huge country, a major population, mid 20 millions in population. They've been fighting different wars like the 7 Years' War. And so in England and in a lot of Europe, they looked at this as a chance potentially to weaken France, this classic rival of theirs. Plus, even in places like England, where they had had a glorious revolution in 1688, there were some that just wanted to see limits placed on the monarchy of France, right? So reshuffle the political order. Maybe a parliamentary system would be good at chilling out the power of France. Okay. The conservative view came out in 1790. So a couple months after the start of the French Revolution, so like the Tennis Court Oath and the Bastille, all that, several months later, Edmund Burke, an English rich guy, a landed noble, came out with this scathing condemnation from something called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And basically, what he said is that hierarchy is natural and that this thing in France was going to become lawless and turn into anarchy, and it would be, annihilation of classes, which would lead to tyranny of the masses, mob rule, which really pissed off a lot of Republican-minded, more liberal-minded people. And so Mary Wollstonecraft is a nice example of somebody who was completely frustrated by this. And so she right away wrote a rebuttal called The Vindication of the Rights of Man. And then eventually she wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And she said, like, hop off. People need individual rights. It's not always so easy for the rest of us. You're from the privileged order where government functions for you. But for the rest of us, government hasn't done anything for us. Which then brings us to question 1B. What else did Wollstonecraft say? And Wollstonecraft, in The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, was really one of the first kind of clear early modern revolutionary feminists of the time, right? She saw in the Enlightenment and the potential of the French Revolution to bring women closer to equality. And not equality like let's artificially let women be better than men, but give them opportunities, allow them to be educated. It will allow man to maybe up their game, right? If women start to look good and exert themselves, then men should have nothing to fear. They should prove how great they are, and that, competition would drive men on. Okay. Question 2. Explain how the other powers of continental Europe viewed the French Revolution and why those views would change, and then explain some treaties that would impact that power. So as I stated before, a lot of European nations, going back to the map, wanted to see France weakened. They wanted France to be knocked off of its pedestal. And so, for example, when we kind of look at the hierarchy, Great Britain would have no problem with a weaker France, right? These German states, places like Prussia, the Dutch, classic enemies, Spain, all kind of would like to see France hurt, punished a little bit. Now, traditionally, the Habsburgs would have been the most likely opponent. But remember, through marriage, Marie Antoinette is a Habsburg. And so you wouldn't necessarily they wouldn't want to see a weakened France because that could jeopardize their daughter, not only just her prestige, but actually her physical well-being. And so that's kind of where it starts. All right, so then the second part of the question, is looking at why did those views change? And early on in the revolution, those views start to change because there's this fear that there's a growing violence, a growing radicalism of the people, a popularism to this revolution. So Catherine the Great is a really nice example here, right? So remember we talked about Catherine being an enlightened despot and maybe even dabbling with the idea of ending serfdom in Russia. But as she saw things like the storming of the Bastille and the Women's March to Versailles, and sadly, when we get further and further in the growing radicalism, popularism of the French Revolution, she feared the masses. And so specifically, the book has a nice little quote in here. It says, When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were arrested and returned to Paris for trying to sneak out in 1791. So Louis, after the Women's March, had been arrested and kind of kept in Paris as like a fancy house guest. They tried to make a break for it, and they had tried to get to the Austrian border so that Marie Antoinette could be reunited with her family, and then the Austrians would reinvade France and end the revolution. And so it says here, the monarchs of Austria and Prussia had issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. This carefully worded this worded statement declared their willingness to intervene in France in certain circumstances, and it was expected to have a sobering effect on the revolutions. So that's the Declaration of Pillnitz. Okay, there's another thing called the Brunswick Manifesto. That's another treaty or statement that comes out. And basically that said, hey, if you harm Louis or Marie, when Austria invades France, we will take Paris and we will annihilate the city, right? That will be retribution. If you harm the monarchs, we will destroy the revolution and all the radicals living in Paris. And so that takes everything up a notch, right? Everything starts to escalate at that point. And instead of actually cooling the revolution down, it makes it even more radical because the revolutionaries see this as a threat, right? We're fighting for our very survival now at this moment. Okay, so question 3 says, list at least 3 examples of how liberal enlightened revolutionaries were replacing the traditions and superstitions of the old regime. All right, so we talked about some of this in class already, right? But revolutionary fashion, the cockade, red, white, and blue dress, those kind of things became popular. Calling each other citizen or thou instead of like merci or madame, monsieur, right? So using a more citizen-based or a more common way of addressing each other. They held these giant festivals and they renamed or redid the calendar. I will talk a lot more about this in class later. Something called the Revolutionary Calendar. So they got rid of the traditional Catholic Gregorian calendar and instead had a 10-month, right, 10-day week. And so like this very organized, very enlightened way of looking at it, and replaced all the old saints holidays with revolutionary holidays as well, right? Things that celebrated things like virtue and justice. They renamed the streets. So anything that had a saint's name was replaced, right? So they really tried to secularize society and instead worship things like virtue, wisdom, justice, liberty, those kind of things. Fraternity became those. Now, this next question is a little confusing. All right, so it says describe the 3 major political parties. They only really mention 2 of them in the book. I need to rewrite this question. That's my bad. So there's a group called the Mountain and another one called the Girondins. All right, the Mountain are the radicals. They were the bad boys of the convention. They sat up way up in the bleachers and would heckle people. They were certainly the most radical of the people. So Robespierre, Saint-Just, Jean-Paul Marat, Danton, they were all these radical Mountain. And they were the people who supported executing the king. They supported the reign of terror. They supported de-Christianization and secularizing society, pretty radical stuff. The Girondins, on the other hand, were more popular in the countryside and they were much more moderate. Although they wanted things like individual rights and better tax policies, representative government, they were uneasy with bloodshed. They didn't want to see Paris and like the sans-culottes, the mob of people kind of running the show. They were very skeptical about the abuse of power. And they were convinced that secularism would be the destruction of France. Right? They wanted to maintain Catholicism. And the third group was a group called the Plain, and they were kind of the swing vote. They started as the moderates, and as the Girondins becomes more conservative and anti-revolutionary, as things get bloody and kind of gross, the Plain kind of becomes that moderate midpoint. And then it says, what group or demographic eventually breaks the deadlock and becomes the militant hand of the radicals? That is the sans-culottes. They become kind of the street team. So the Mountain are in the political functions, and then the sans-culottes are out on the streets actually, sadly, killing people, committing these assassinations, fake trials, storming of the Bastille. I mean, like those events are perpetrated by the radical Parisian sans-culottes. All right, so here we go. Question 5. Identify and explain 3 methods used by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety to ensure the success of the revolution in France. So this is really the heart of the radical revolution. Right? This is where it kind of gets crazy. So on 708 on the right-hand side of the page, it talks about some things, and one was economic controls. The economy, which had been horrible at the start of the revolution, still had not really gotten better for the average person. And so what they started to hate was merchants. They hated capitalists because they viewed them as only self-serving. And so they put into place what they call price ceilings, meaning that like there was a maximum price that could be charged for bread or grain and no higher, with the hope that it would keep people able to buy these essential items. And so that was one step. Another step was they switched into like full-scale war mode, right? So at this point in the revolution, the Prussians and the Austrians had already invaded France to challenge the revolution. And so they went into full-scale war mode, requiring men to service in the military, increasing the amount of guns and munitions. I mean, they went full on into war production. And so it would have felt rather kind of socialist or totalitarian, really, for a while. Planned economy, controls over items, setting up monopolies and government-sponsored factories to produce war goods. I mean, it would have felt like, total war of World War I and World War II. The last one is probably the most frightening of them all, and it's an age or a phase called the Reign of Terror. And what happens in the Reign of Terror is basically they militarize society against enemies of the revolution. And so people who weren't supporting the revolution, who weren't enthusiastic enough, people who maybe whispered or said bad things about the revolution, could find themselves kind of on the list. And so as time went on, Jean-Paul Marat and his newspaper, The Friend of the People, would print the names. Radicals in the city, like the sans-culottes, would find these people and kill them. And then Robespierre eventually started to stoke this. Now, this Committee of Public Safety mentioned here was basically a 12-man dictatorship, with Robespierre being like the first among equals. So he kind of became the de facto dictator. But it was scary times. Hundreds of thousands of people were guillotined during this time period, and people start to freak out, which brings us to kind of the last couple points. What event is considered the start of the Thermidorian reaction? Well, there's a moment in July of 1794, which under the revolutionary calendar was known as Thermidor, where Robespierre was going to give a speech in the convention to name more suspects. And a conspiracy had been started with some of Robespierre's radical allies and some moderates got together, and they refused to let him talk. And that's known as the Thermidorian reaction. And so the revolution had turned on Robespierre. They were no longer interested in having this radical fear-mongering, bloodthirstiness. They wanted it to stop. So what does this indicate about the future of the revolution, and what happened to the power and influence of the sans-culottes? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in question 6. It says, who led this reaction? What were the changes? So we mentioned the conspiracy. Some of the changes where they immediately got rid of these controls on the economy. They printed more money, which sadly led to huge spikes in prices. Inflation set in. They restricted the press. They restricted secret societies. They outlawed the Jacobin Club. So they really kind of clamped down. Right now, question 7. Influence dropped. Right, initially, like right away, the sans-culottes tried to rebel. There was major protests in Paris, and the new moderate government under the Thermidor just called in the troops and killed the protesters. We have a government using its military against its own people. And what did this indicate? They wanted stability. They wanted to end the radicalism, and they were kind of willing to do that by any means necessary. They were going to crush the radicals. All right, and then the final topic, the last one here, is what was the Directory and what problems would it face? Okay, So the Directory at the end of all of this was basically a 5-man collective executive branch. And it was horribly disorganized. It was horribly corrupt. It was very pro-business, very bourgeois middle class. And that's kind of why they created it. They wanted it to be disorganized and ineffective. They wanted too many checks and balances to avoid another dictator like a Robespierre who would go radical and kill his enemies. And so that was a big problem. Now, there were two major other issues that they had to deal with. War. France's enemies hadn't stopped marching against France, right? So just because the revolution was less radical doesn't mean that Austria and Prussia were happy. So they got to fight a war. And now that Robespierre and all of his homies are out of power, the war is actually going down. I mean, it's actually going worse now. And then, two, the other thing that's kind of a problem is starvation and economic problems were bad. So you had like this wealthy capitalist elite that were actually doing okay and making money. But some of those early revolutionary problems like starvation, inflation, difficulty to find jobs, they were still there, right? They hadn't solved the underlying problems yet. And it will take a real hero, a real genius, an innovative man to fix those kind of problems. Come on. You know who it's going to be. It's going to be your boy, Napoleon. All right. Catch you later, guys.